Yes, so here we have the agenda of today's meeting. So we will go over this brief introduction from my point, and then we will give some highlights of the project results considering our stakeholder interactions, assessment, identification assessment of tools, our collation of data for enabling assessment of the tools, and also finally, an introduction to the caLIBRAte Nano-risk Innovation Governance Framework and a peek into the web-based Nano-risk governance portal. So next slide, please. Yes, this is the introduction to the caLIBRAte project. Please go ahead. Next slide. So first of all, caLIBRAte is the acronym for Performance Testing, Calibration and Implementation of a Next Generation Systems of Systems Risk Governance Framework for Nanomaterials. Next slide, please. We are a project consisting of 24 partners coordinated here from Copenhagen by me at the National Research Center for the Working Environment, and with our administrative coordinator, Marina Moser Johansen, as my solid backbone in the project. We have 21 partners from Europe, and of those are 2 from Switzerland, and then we also have participation from the US, 2, Duke University and RTI, and then we have the National Institute of Occupational Health from South Africa. We have a total budget of 9.7 million euro, and of that, about 8 million are coming from the European Union, and the rest are coming from our external partners, non-EU partners in the project. The project has been running for 42 months, and this is the last days of the project, so at the very end of month 42. Next slide, please. So the starting point of this project and a lot of the other nano projects that has been funded by the European Commission is that nano is out there and it's growing. And we currently have this situation that there's a lot of activity in the development of nanomaterials and application of nanomaterials into projects. And this map of the world is taken from the EU1, the European Union website supported by or running in parallel to the ECHA website, showing the number of nano organizations and their distributions worldwide. And as you can see, there are a number of institutions, organizations around the world working on nano materials, and we can also see a very significant amount of these institutions and organizations are private commercial SMEs and private companies. So there is definitely an industrialization of nanomaterials going on. The problem, you can say, is that at least at the starting point of this project is that there was no nano regulation, there was no valid methodology to do risk assessment, and tools for performing risk assessments were not tested against nanomaterials, and that was seen as a big obstacle. So now the world has changed a little bit, because in Europe, REACH will take effect for nanomaterials by January 2020, but we're still in a situation where the methodologies are not fully developed and there are not yet a suite of confirmed risk assessment tools that can be used for assessment of nanomaterials. So this is partly the focus of our project. So if you go on to the next slide. So the key objective of caLIBRAte was to develop a nano-risk governance framework and a web-based tool or portal for the assessment and management of the human and environmental risks of nanomaterial and nano-enabled products, and consider this during both innovation and use. And the anticipation was that the framework and the overall tool should provide possibility for screening of apparent and perceived risks and trends in nanotechnology. We should be able to do control banding, qualitative and fully integrated predictive quantitative risk assessment, which should also be operational at different information levels. We should be able to consider safety by design assessment and also enable multi-criteria decision support. It was also a wish to do risk monitoring, risk management, and developing supporting guidance documents. And the initial starting points from our project was the so-called Cooper Stage-Gate product innovation model and the established risk governance framework, ISO 31000, and also the emerging risk management framework, which was at that point a German document pre-standard. Next slide, please. So if we think about the risk assessment or pre-risk assessment as expressed in the emerging risk management framework, then we have a phase where we go through horizon scanning, and then you do pre-risk assessment and continue to risk assessment, risk management and decision, communication and consultation and monitoring. And if we consider a normal process, one click, then a normal process would normally go from identification of a risk, and then you collect your information and you perform a risk assessment. But when you don't have enough information or low level information, you have to go through a pre-risk assessment process, and you can either do a stepwise approach where you have a pre-risk assessment followed by risk assessment and then finally risk management and decision. But if you click on the next click once more, then if you have a good pre-risk assessment methodology that you can rely on, you can actually make risk management and decisions based on a lower level of information that is required for a full risk assessment. And if we, on top of that, consider that we have innovation, then the Cooper Stage-Gate system is a process where you go through discovery and an idea, and then you go through different steps until you reach the market. The conceptual nano-risk innovation governance framework that we have considered in our project is that we basically combine the emerging risk management framework and the Cooper Stage-Gate innovation funnel. So at each of these stage gates in the process of the innovation, we will have conducted emerging risk assessment or emerging risk management to be able to create the foundations for our decisions at the different gates in our stage-gate model. And in this model, you should understand that before each of the gate, we have a project phase, discovery, idea, scoping, build business case, research and development, testing and validation, and launch, and finally horizon scanning or monitoring. And the gates are decision points where we decide whether the innovation can continue forward. The requirement for doing this is that we should be able to do assessments based on a low level information. That would mean that in the early stages of the risk assessment, these will be qualitative or semi-quantitative. Whereas when we approach the end of the innovation funnel and want to reach the market, then we need to have a quantitative, predictive, and test data-driven assessment. However, to be able to do that, the tools must be aligned with user needs and capacities. They will change along this innovation. Maybe they will do risk assessments in the labs or even pre-risk assessments in the office before they start an innovation. Next click, please. And we also know that the tool testing and validation is key to reach the confidence. So we need to document that the tools work for purpose. And finally, testing and validation requires appropriate test data. We can get nowhere with the testing and validation of tools if we don't have good data to be able to do our testing. So next slide, please. So we had some requests from the European Union on the projects, and first of all, it was a key request that we try to build on what has been developed before, so harvest and implement on the results from previous studies, ongoing as well as planned research in the area of risk governance. Next bullet. We should also address the stakeholder needs and concerns, and we should also try to include issues that would be relevant for the insurance sector. And we should in particular try to understand better the risk perception among the different stakeholders. We should also focus on the testing, the calibration and further development of the risk prioritization or banding tools for both human and environment. And we should emphasize development of guidance for important issues in the risk assessment. And finally, we should improve our equity and trust in the risk communication by having a better understanding of the risks and the benefits and uncertainties that are related to the nanotechnologies, nanomaterials, or nanoproducts. And in this way, be able to do a better informed risk, to improve the informed risk acceptance. So our vision for the Nano-risk Innovation Governance Portal, or basically the final funneled outcome of our projects, would be to create a portal that would be a central site for gathering or linking out the validated information, results, and tools to support the nano-risk innovation governance, and also try to provide the researchers and industry in a project platform from which they can manage their nano-risk assessment, the management, and their overall governance during innovation and production. So that means that the portal should provide qualified information on nanomaterials and products and their safety and risk perception, should have links to demonstrated and validated tools for horizon scanning, risk assessment, and management, should be able to give access to qualified nano safety data, and finally give good guidance and good practice information that are relevant for the various stakeholder groups. Next slide, please. So to conduct our work, we have been working in I can say, basically 4 principal pillars. So one part is the development of the framework for risk governance, which contains conceptual framework development, and then developing of guidance and documents, and of course then integration into our nano-risk governance portal. But first of all, aligning with the stakeholders to understand what are their views, their concerns and needs. And this provides quite widely into the project, also into the selection and identification and selection of tools that can support the risk governance framework that we have laid out, both on one hand the Cooper Stage-Gate innovation funnel, but also the emergent risk management framework. And the model development and testing includes, of course, identification of the tools, selection of the tools that fit user needs, and then testing of their performance and sensitivity, etc. To be able to do that, we need to harvest and generate data to create a database or a data library that we can use for testing our tools. So this has also been a very extensive work where we have collected existing data, created a data library for our tool testing, and finally in the end we move towards a comprehensive database, and we cover both in this aspect physicochemical characteristics, hazard data, and exposure and release data. Next slide, please. So first of all, as I mentioned, it was very important for us to understand where are the stakeholders in this business. So we have been investigating stakeholders quite broadly. These are some of the stakeholders that we have had around the table, imaginary or in reality. And this will be the focus of the first presentation after this one. Next slide, please. So by that, I hope that you will enjoy the next hour or so going into the details of the caLIBRAte project, and I will leave it now for the next speaker to start. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Kel. So our next speaker is Andrea Porcari from ERI, and he'll be talking about the stakeholder risk perception and needs. And Andrea, you should be free to speak now.
Welcome, everybody. Andrea Porcari. Thanks, Sean, for the introduction. So I will provide you a brief overview of our broad stakeholder consultation on nano-risk governance, with a particular focus on our researchers and industry representatives. Next slide, please. We used for our stakeholder consultation a mixed method, including qualitative and quantitative methods. We addressed both informed stakeholders and non-informed stakeholders, so public respondents. The focus of today will be mainly on informed stakeholders, we made a 2-round Delphi survey and a number of interviews involving more than 150 stakeholders in Europe and worldwide. We addressed all areas of risk governance, assessment, perception, management, and communication with participants from research, industry, policymakers, and users, and the general public. This survey was made in 2 years, 2017, 2018, and now there's an article in press with the summary of all results. Next slide, please. There's a medium to high perception of the risk of nanomaterials by all stakeholders, in particular in risk domains as workers' health, public health, and the environment, as you can see by the graph. And users, society representatives are the most concerned, followed by industry research, where are the orange and the yellow, and then the policymakers and regulators in green. Next slide, please. We also made an analysis looking at the sectors of application of nanotechnology. As you can see, the highest concern is for products in contact that can come in contact with the body, like agri-food, cosmetics, packaging, textile, and this is quite in line also with other consultations made in the last decade. There are concerns also regarding, in particular, regarding environment and chemicals and materials. And as you can see, there are differences between the different stakeholders, though all of them agree on the most relevant sectors of application. Next slide, please. We also tried to explore the factors limiting acceptance of nanomaterials. We asked to what extent the perceived uncertainty in the safety of nanomaterials and nano-enabled products was seen as a limitation to their diffusion in the market and their use. And as you can see, for large majority of stakeholders, this is a barrier. And if we look at the industry respondents, more than almost half of them think this is really a major barrier to market exploitation of nanomaterials. Next slide, please. So overall, from our stakeholder consultation, we can say that there's a general positive attitude toward nanotech development in most of the application sectors, from public respondents and informed stakeholders. Nanotechnology is seen as a symbol of innovation and progress, but people are as well aware that their use could imply both benefits and risks. As we said, there's a medium to high perception of risk of nanomaterials, and safety of workers, consumer, public health, impact on the environment are the areas that require attention. Overall, we have seen a convergence of opinions on the need to address the risk of nanomaterials. And this is a little different compared to what has been seen in previous consultation made in the last decade, where there were different positions from stakeholders. Here there's a clear agreement and a clear awareness on risk of nanomaterials. Next slide, please. In terms of risk assessment and management, stakeholders strongly believe there's a need for further research on evidence-based approaches for risk analysis, in particular, understanding long-term impacts on health environment of nanomaterials and making available quality and reliable EHS data and databases. The risk assessment procedures are seen essential to manage risks. This was also mentioned by Kel in the previous presentation. And the existing regulatory frameworks are considered not fully satisfactory, or at least not sufficiently comprehensive to deal with nanomaterials. Issues and problems regard the lack of harmonized approaches across regulatory domains, uncertainties in the implementation of regulation, the issue of definition of nanomaterials. And though this is not, say, a quantitative result, our feeling in looking at the results is that there's also a lack of awareness on the applicability of these existing norms. I mean, nowadays in Europe, nanomaterials are included in several regulations, but sometimes it seems that stakeholders were not fully aware of this. But of course, this is just a feeling. You can go to the next slide, please. We ask also which information should be provided about nanomaterials to end users and consumers, and you can see here in the bar graphs the results. Overall, we can say that there's a need to provide evidence-based information on the safe use of nanomaterials. It's an essential aspect for all stakeholders. And the point here is not much understanding if a nanomaterial is safe or not, but how to safely use nanomaterials. Next slide, please. In terms of risk communication, based on the radar graph I showed you before, we understood that there's a need for more information on risk benefits, in particular in specific use scenarios. There's an issue of misleading or biased information on nanomaterials and nanoproducts, and sometimes a lack of transparency in product information. Next slide. This is also reflected in qualitative comments from, in particular, industry research representatives. You can read here in the slide. There's a lack of scientific evidence from nanosafety studies, a lack of transparency about which products contains which nanomaterials. Another stakeholder said, I believe we need to have good methods to assess and also to communicate risks. Another one underlined the need for technical data and information that are currently not transparent and understandable enough for end users. And so this is all about risk communication. Another stakeholder said nano governance should not only consider the safety, but also maintain the innovation in nanotech. So here is the issue of risk benefit cost balance. Next slide, please. So from our analysis, we concluded with some very important needs or priorities for stakeholders in terms of risk governance of nanomaterials listed in this slide. First, continuing research on methods and data for risk assessment, including long-term impacts, harmonization of risk management approaches, and alignment of these approaches with regulatory frameworks, improving awareness and confidence on regulation, providing access to reliable information and guidance on safe handling, use, and disposal of nanomaterials and products, all along the research and innovation value chain, from the producer to the consumer. Risk communication is an important point, and it needs to be improved not only toward the consumers, but also between and toward informed stakeholders in research to business and business to business interaction. And all stakeholders agree on the need to strengthen tools and models to help learning and orientation in decision-making on safety of nanomaterials. And the work of CALIBRATE, in a way or the other, is addressing all those aspects, as you will see also in the next presentations. So next slide. Thanks for your attention, and you will be able to find a more detailed analysis of those results in a publication that will be available in a few weeks. Thanks again.
Thank you very much for that, Andrea. So, moving on, the next presentation, as we move on to look at the tools that have been considered for the CALIBRATE Nano-risk Innovation Governance Framework, the next presenter will be Wouter Fransman from TNO, who will talk about the selection of tools for human risk assessment. So, Wouter, I have unmuted you, but I think you're self-muted, so you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. The bit I'm going to talk about is on the human risk assessment tools and models, and Sarah after me in a couple of minutes will focus on the environmental risk assessment tools, because they both require quite a different methodology and set of tools and frameworks. So next slide, please, Sean. So the objectives of this work activity was to further compile and develop models and tools, both from the exposure point of view as well as the hazard point of view, which in combination make the risk assessment models, and to position these along the different stage gates in the Cooper stage gate model that Kel showed in the beginning of the presentations. And the last bit that Penny Newmark will present later on is how to integrate innovative methods or new approach methodologies in those tools and models to further improve them. Next slide, please, Sean. So this is again the Cooper stage gate model, going from left to right, from the first idea into the launch of a nanomaterial or a nano-enabled product. And if you click further, Sean, you'll notice that we set up a set of criteria that we asked the stakeholders to identify their wishes and needs in the various stage gates, and we split those into 3 different sets of criteria. First of all, a set of overall criteria that were concerned with, for instance, cost or the level of expertise that was needed to run the models. The second part was on input information, so input requirements to be able to run the models. For instance, physicochemical properties or hazard information that you need to complete and run the models. And the third set of criteria was on the output requirements. So what would stakeholders would like to get out of the tools and the models to be able to perform their risk assessment. Next slide, please. So the first thing we did was made a full overview of all the available models at that time when we started the project. And we had a few criteria to select those. And if you click, Sean, you'll see that first of all, the tool needs to be ready and available. And the tool should be a software tool. So as far as we know, there's a lot of protocols and hand paper written documentation on how to work or deal with nanomaterials, but we could only include software tools in this at this moment. And there were a few exceptions that we needed to stress at the beginning of the project, which was the Guide Nano tool, which was not finalized by the beginning of the project because that project that developed the tool was just ending. The Sun Decision Support System was basically the same thing. They were still developing it at the beginning of the caLIBRAte project, and there was some guidance material in the Netherlands specifically, which has never made it to a software tool. So we excluded those from the list of tools. Next slide, please. So what we did was we asked all of these stakeholders for these criteria. We matched those criteria with the model parameters that were needed to run the models, and that with a mathematical scoring system came up with a list of top ranking tools for each of the different stage gates. And the full overview of that is given here. And if you click further, Sean, you'll see that there were some highlights to mention here, which is the Stoffenmanager Nano. It's important to know that that's also included inside the Leica Nano scan, so that has been used in double. There were a few models that were not nano specific, but they were actually screened because they could yield some interesting results from the generic point of view, but they were excluded from these lists because they're not nano specific, but used for other chemical substances. And the risk of the model, although it was not in the top ranking list of models, we decided to include it anyway because it was the only dermal exposure assessment tools amidst all the other tools that were mainly focused on inhalation exposure. Next slide, please, Sean. So the next step, and Penny Newmark is going to present more about this, was in the end the project, and that's still running also after the course of the project, is to try and provide guidance and try to convince both tool developers as well as tool users to make use of the innovation that's going on and all the new methodologies that arise over the last 10, 15 years. So we provided some guidance documentation guided towards the tool developers and the tool owners on how they could further improve their tools to be able to include all these norms. And we provided guidance material for the tool users to be able to use new approach methodologies to improve their input parameters that they could put into this model. This was my last slide. Thanks very much.
Thank you ever so much for that, Wouter. And whilst I'm just unmuting Sarah, who's going to give the next presentation on selecting tools for environmental risk assessment, just to remind everyone, if you've got any specific questions, you can either ask them at the end, or indeed you can start putting your questions into the chat where we can bring them up at the end again. So Sarah, you should be free to unmute yourself and begin talking.
Yes, thank you so much, Sean. Yeah, so I will present the selection of 2 candidates for environmental risk assessment tools. And this is, of course, very much in parallel with the process that Wouter has just described for the human risk assessment tools. Next slide, please. So very briefly, we wanted to identify those available tools that are suitable for environmental risk assessment of nanomaterials at different phases of the innovation process. And also, these tools should accommodate the needs of the different stakeholders. The first thing that we did was to compile all the environmental risk assessment tools that had some relevance for nanomaterials and which had been published in peer review journals. Then we had some stakeholder consultations. Some of these were together with the team working on human risk assessment tools, because in many ways the criteria of stakeholders for human risk assessment and for environmental risk assessment are overlapping, at least when it comes to general things such as resources and expertise needed to run the models. So basically, we wanted to know from stakeholders, what do they need from environmental risk assessment tools at different phases of innovation. And for this, we use questionnaires. Also, some were specific to environmental risk assessment tools. And we also conducted phone interviews. Then, as the last thing, we had to evaluate each of the compiled models. So we had to see, how does the model fit the stakeholder needs at each phase of the innovation. I think you're a bit too far ahead, Sean, there. Sorry. If you can just skip back a slide. Yeah, thanks. So in order to fit the models to the stakeholder needs, we developed a scoring scheme, much like Wouter also explained, but the scoring schemes were different. And the reason that we wanted to have a scoring scheme is to allow for a sort of semi-quantitative assessment of the models, in order to also get a visual overview of which tools fit the best to the different phases of innovation. Next slide, please. So on your right, you see the resulting, what we call heat map. It illustrates how well the different models that are listed to the left in the heat map, how well these fit to the different innovation phases that are on the right, listed on the right. As you can see here, we in total compiled different models, in total 38, and these were in the categories of flow, fate, hazard, uptake, and risk assessment. If the models are poor fit to the criteria of a phase, then it will be red and have a low score. The medium scores are yellow, and when they have a good fit, they are green. So it provided an easy overview of this fit of models to phase gates. As you can see, many of the models score very low at the initial phases, and as Kel said in the beginning, this is because the costs and resources available in the initial phases are not as great as later on in the process. The closer we get to the launch of the product, the more resources often are allocated to risk assessment purposes. So in the middle phases, as you can see, where we have these more resources allocated, there are also many more of these complex models that becomes more suitable for use. Regulatory compliance was identified as a major stakeholder criteria, and this is also reflected in the final tool selection that you can see on your left. So we have models in the categories of fate, hazard, and risk, which are basically very representative of the whole regulatory risk assessment procedures. Next slide, please. So I cannot, of course, obviously go through everything, the questionnaires, the feedback that we got, and the details of our scoring scheme. But if you want to know more, we have this publication out and you can find all the details there. So thank you for that. And I'm moving on to the next speaker.
Thank you so much for that, Sarah. So our next speaker is Penny Nymark, who is now unmuted, and she'll be talking about the beginning of the session on data for risk governance, and specifically looking at PhysChem and tox data.
Thanks, Cal. So first, I'd like to clarify, I think there was a bit of a misunderstanding. Wouter was referring to me as presenting on the innovative methods, but I think, and I'm actually presenting on data today, so that was a bit of a misunderstanding. But I think Wouter already did a good job on presenting what we did on the new methods, and we can surely provide more information for those interested in that later on. So I will go on with the data aspect. So I think you can go to the next slide, Sean. So just a brief overview of how we position the data collection in relation to the tool selection. So this was something that was happening in parallel, but also slightly after the initial selection of tools to have to be sure that we have data fit for purpose. So actually fitting into the tools and thereby allowing testing. So you can change this slide. Okay, so I'm going to talk about around this slide for now 5 minutes, I hope. So what we did was we started off with looking at what was required by the tools. So that was really important, so that we actually focused on data that can be used in the tools. So that was a process coupled to the tool owners and tool users that know what kind of parameters are required and what type of data can be used for answering those parameters. And then we moved on to a second step where we started looking at actual data that is available, and that was coupled to a survey done together with the Nano Safety Cluster to see what data is out there and what data we can actually gather. Some data have not been made openly available, and that of course limits our gathering efforts. So, and then when we had gathered data, we then started looking at data gaps. That was quite an extensive job to look into what is missing in relation to what is required by the tools, and so that we can actually test them on a sufficient level to gain confidence in the tools. And that was followed then by also looking at the quality of the data, because of course we want to use as high enough quality data as possible to really build that confidence. And we established what we call the CALIBRAte quality evaluation method, which is openly available already. The deliverable has been shared with several projects so far and can be distributed openly at the moment, so that's available. And what we found was largely at this point that, or one of the main points we saw was that data does need curation, and one main thing that we recognized among the data was a lack of metadata. So the quality of the data was not by itself bad in any way, but it just lacks information about the data. So metadata is data about the data. And that was a large thing that reduced the quality. So we went on with a method a first-tier method to use data of a sufficient level quality for tool testing. But then based on all the above, we then generated quite a large set of data to fill the gaps that were identified in the gap analysis. And that was, for one part, based on information from additional sources like DNLs and DMLs and ecotox data that were found from other sources than the ones identified in the survey. And we also generated new PhysChem data, size, composition, and so on, and also dustiness data, for example, quite extensively. And then we also generated a large set of tox data, so pulmonary toxicity, ecotox, eye and skin irritation, and quite a large set of high throughput screening data also from several nanomaterials. Now, although FAIR was not really the focus of in the project at the time, we did this before the FAIR, the so-called FAIR principles, so the findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable principles for data were established or published. But we actually, by integrating all this data and implementing it into the eNanoMapper database, we actually automatically have made it and are continuously making it more and more fair. So all this data will be accessible and findable through the CALIBRAte database. So of course, open does not equal to fair, so there are certain restrictions on certain parts of the data until it is published and so on, but it is fair and in a sense available and findable. So if you see here on the right of the slide, you see the actual CALIBRAte database, which follows the eNanoMapper database model, which makes the data searchable also. And you see that it covers, I've pointed out some parts here where you see that it covers 6 projects. There's Nano-reg data and the CALIBRAte data itself, nano-test data, and so on from different projects, previous projects. And it covers 60 nanomaterials and 120 methods that have been used variably on those materials. And so that's basically the CALIBRAte database, which is then the basis for the actual tool testing and covers much of the data that is needed for tool testing. Okay, you can change the slide. I think it just shows the partners, but we were several people involved in this, and it was not a small job. So thank you.
Thanks ever so much for that, Penny. And without further ado, we can move on to the next presentation, which will be given by Soko on establishing a library of high-quality exposure data suitable for tool testing. So Soko, I have unmuted you, so you should be able to just make a start.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. So I will continue talking about data collection and high-quality data, but in this case, we focus on exposure data for tool testing. So next slide. So our objective here within CALIBRAte was to establish and to provide value chain case studies and generate data or high quality data to use this for model performance and to include and make it usable for the CALIBRAte Nano-risk governance portal. For that, we focus mainly in, or we actually follow 3 big steps, which was one is the collection in an inventory of all case studies that are available from different sources, then to provide a methodology for evaluating this data collected and provide libraries of high quality data for in the exposure area, and then generate case studies for that cover different stages of the product innovation process. So next slide. So in terms of collection of data from existing data that was there, we have collected a high number of value chain case studies data, and suitable for different purposes, for human and environmental risk assessment tools. And we collected them, and we saw that the more data that the data that was available were more focused on occupational domain, but of course we have also case studies for the different environmental risk assessment and for the models that are covering more life cycle, whole life cycle. So, and the next slide is how the methodology that we use and that we provide for evaluating this data, the collected data. So we came up with a methodology based on 3 main parameters, which was the relevance, reliability, and completeness of the data, with referring to different with the different description of data that was in these studies, and this how many parameters that are really that the models are really demanding for these parameters, and how many of these parameters are in these studies, and then we give a weighing factor, a score that allows us to come up with an overall quality value for ranking this data. And we got out of this evaluation process, we got 48 good quality case studies, and they were suitable for model testing. So in the next slide, what we show here is that, summarizing, we came up at the end with 3 new value chain case studies and 4 existing value chain case studies that we were the existing value chain case studies. We were filling up gaps that were identified when we collect data for these case studies, and we could fill in these gaps and provide full data for the different case studies that were already collected. And then we provide also 3 new value chain case studies from a paint manufacturing case study, one for the silica-based construction materials for outdoors, and one coming from the printed electronics case study from the Comada project. So what the information that we give to the final user is which data are needed for these models, and which is the models that are possible to consider for suitable for the specific exposure scenario that we have the data. So so I think next slide is just to thank for your attention, and also for the contributions of all the people contributed to this work. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much for that. So now we're moving on to look at how the tools were qualified through testing. And our first speaker in this section is Mika. So I'll just quickly unmute you, Mika, so you are free to start.
Hello. So in this talk, I will talk a little bit about the testing and the process that the models were undergoing while being selected for the framework So you can show the next slide. So there was several levels of testing that the models were undergoing. So at the first part that has already been talked about, the models were assessed against the stakeholder needs, and after they had passed this filter, they were then subjected to a sensitivity analysis and the performance testing. And then the difference between these two things is that the sensitivity analysis was basically looking at how these models and tools, which basically take a number of input parameters, and then based on these inputs they give a result. So the sensitivity testing was looking at how the model responds to these inputs, and trying to find the critical inputs and try to find out if there is some problematic behavior. And the basic idea here was to use a range of possible realistic values that could go into the model and see how it responds. The models respond to this kind of inputs. And then there was the performance testing, which answers the question like, how does the model fulfill its function? So there's a user applying the model, and the actual comparison point here is the real world. So like the data that was presented in previous talks, and from the real case studies. And next slide, please. So in order to do this, of course, we had to first map out all the inputs and outputs and then of the models that had passed them, gone past or into the assessment, and there were 16 nanospecific models, and in total there was close to 1,000 different inputs for the nanospecific values, and only a small subset of the input values for all these models was shared in an exact manner between the different models. So that was quite a heterogeneous number of inputs, and was quite a big effort to map these out and find the possible values. Luckily, the data formats themselves for the models were found to be, in general, quite simple, so there was no difficulties to transfer the data to the models, and there was no proprietary data formats and or very complex formats that would require a lot of effort to input the data to the models. So after we had done input and output mapping, we then could start doing the sensitivity testing. Next slide, please. So for the human risk assessment models that we had, basically already in this human risk assessment category, there was a range of different models which were quite different in their approach. So some of them were more quantitative, and some were more like question, yes, no answer based ones. And because the model types were quite varied, there was a mixed approach also for the sensitivity testing. And the basic approaches that we took in the sensitivity testing were the one at a time, where the different input variables were varied within a reasonable or realistic range that they could achieve, and the other values were kept at a default constant value, and then the model behavior was studied with the variation. Then for this kind of yes no answers, there was a diagnostic method used where uncertainty in the answers that the user is giving to the model was applied, so that there's a chance of the user making a mistake at some of the step in doing the model, and then the model responds in general to a different level of certainty in the different questions was studied, whether it's possible to end up in totally a wrong kind of answer based on the uncertainty in these answers. And then in some cases it was possible to do a Monte Carlo study where there was a large number of inputs within a given range was put into the model, and it was run, for example, 10,000 times, and then the range of outputs could be compared. That can be seen in the bottom right corner, a result of such sensitivity testing. Basically, the results of the sensitivity testing allowed us to identify and communicate to the model owners and to the project most and least sensitive parameters. For example, a lot of the sensitive parameters are physiochemical or exposure related, and then there was some inputs that are not very less sensitive. So this gives us some idea of which data we should especially kind of focus on. And the sensitivity testing here provided the basis then for the further performance testing. So it gave us also insight and information on the models. Next slide. So the performance testing, I think there has been already some information on the data collection for the model. So a big part of the performance testing was really getting the input data to comparison against the real world, and basically the general methodology was finding out the parameters, which was done in the input mapping, and then further with the sensitivity testing and analysis of the model function. There was the parameters that are required by the models, and then the data sources were identified, and data was carefully quality checked with different methodologies, and then this relevant and reliable data was used, and then for each model, each case study or each data case had to be often parameterized, so the same parameters or the same cases had to be formulated in a way that they could be input into each model, and these different cases, the parameterized cases, were then input to the model, and the model response and answers to these was then used as the performance testing to see whether the model is suitable for inclusion for the framework, CALIBRATE framework. The next slide will show an example. Yes, first the criteria also for the performance testing. So one important thing is that the testing, there was different models. So the testing is important to do with the intended purpose of the tool, and for the human risk assessment models, it's done with the derived no effect level and bulk occupational exposure levels. And then the idea was to follow the minimum criteria for the model tool predictions. I will not go through all, but for example, important ones are that the Spearman correlation between the model estimates and measured exposure values, if there's a quantitative exposure value, should be around 0. Or at least 0.6, and there should be no domains where the exposure measurements are consistently above than the model estimate. So it needs to, this should not happen, and the tool should be estimating a reasonable worst case scenario also. Yes, the next slide then will be an example of one performance testing result, which is from the software manager, which comes into it via the Picara nanoscan. So there is the measured particle number concentrations in different scenarios on the y-axis on the left-hand side, and then the output, and we can see that the model scores are, there's a clear positive correlation with the corresponding measured ones, and at the lower levels of exposure there's an overestimation, and the exposure bands also show that they are clearly and nicely in line with the measured particle concentrations. And if you put the next slide, there will be a conclusion that in this form, this software manager nano can be used used for the framework. And here is then altogether the overview of the testing that was done in caLIBRAte for the human risk assessment models. So there's different models, and there is an overview of the variation of the application areas. Then we have a consumer and worker and environmental models, also mixed ones, and then the number of models that were selected in the end. So the models that passed the selection process are the horizon scanning tool developed here, and then the Stoffen Manager Nano, NanoSafer, Cons Expo, the Swift Precautionary Matrix, Likara Nanoscans, and DSM Guide Nano. I think this was my last slide. Oh yes, here's the people who participated.
Okay, Mika, thank you very much for that. And our last speaker in the qualifying tools section is Anders. So I shall quickly unmute you, Anders, and let you take it away. Just let you know you're self-muted, Anders. So if you unmute yourself, you should be able to start talking.
Oh, great. There I am. Great. I hope you can hear me now. Can you hear me now?
Fine. Yeah.
Great. So I'll walk you through briefly how we qualify the tools for environmental risk assessment. Mika told you actually about the methodology, so I thought he would, and therefore I have skipped that, and I'll just ask you for the next slide. And here you can see actually what was our final selection of models. They were in fate and exposure, hazard models, and risk assessment models. I would say for fate and exposure, we chose one model that goes up to the portal, and there are two models for hazard. They're not perhaps really hazard models in the sense that they cannot predict hazard, but they can be used for estimating predicted no effect concentrations that we use in risk assessment of in environmental risk assessment. The last four tools are more complex tools that has environmental components that we also found valid for including in the caLIBRAte website. So next slide. For the exposure models, simple box for nano is what's called a chemical fate model, and that's a bit special because we want to predict the fate and behavior of nanomaterials according to their physchem properties. And it's a specialized model in the sense that the processes here are nanospecific. So what we know from normal chemicals or regular chemicals has to be changed in order to make this kind of model, and that's what simple box for nano is. What caLIBRAte has contributed with here is to add atmospheric dispersion model so that it can be used both for local and for regional estimations of predicted environmental concentrations. And this one was weighed on the scale and found that it could be included in the caLIBRAte portal. Next slide. The hazard models were, as I said, aimed at estimating predicted no effect concentrations for nanomaterials. We developed a model, probabilistic species sensitivity distribution model, that basically takes all the ecotox data for a certain material and fits it to a distribution. And out of this distribution, you can find the hazard quotient where only 5% of the species are affected. And this number is what is used for generating the predicted no effect concentration. We had developed this one and we tested it against an existing model, the nano species sensitivity weighted distribution model, NSSWD. And we tested it against the US EPA model that is traditionally used, a standard method that does not take any nano concerns into consideration. So we tested this. Next slide. And this was the outcome, or some of the outcome. As Mika also told, we tried to vary the input and see how does this matter on the output, keeping things constant and changing one thing at a time. The general outcome, if you look at the y-axis where the HC file is shown, which is comparable to the predicted no effect concentration, is that we are sort of within the same range no matter which model we use. It's obvious that the US EPA model, which is the standard model, has much less precision than the nano models. And what we can see for the nano models is that the PSSD is relatively insensitive to what we do with the data before they come in. Whereas the nano-specific species sensitivity distribution model depends on this and depends on the weighing that we do, and basically also on which type of data is put in. So both of these two models were found to be verified for delivering good quality data and being able to take in nano-specific concerns, and therefore both of those are now in the nano portal, the CALIBRAte portal. Sorry. So the next slide is the summary of my presentation that says the final selection of the model. And with that, I thank you for the attention.
Thank you so much for that, Anders. And so now we return neatly to Kjeld, who is going to give us a brief introduction to the CALIBRAte Nano-risk Innovation Governance Framework. So Kjeld, you're self-muted, so you should be able to unmute yourself.
Thank you very much. Yes, so I will now jump to the next stage where I will discuss a little bit on the development of the Nano-risk governance framework, or innovation governance framework. And now we at the phase of the project where a lot of the information that has been generated in the project is fed back into the development of the framework. And finally, Shomek will continue to talk about how this is integrated into the Nano-risk governance portal. So we are now on the left side of the diagram, framework development, the conceptual framework we discussed, and we'll please go to the next slide. So as we started, excuse me, we had a quite extensive interaction with stakeholders to try and understand what are the key requirements for Nano-risk governance, and we learned that they had, of course, several requests, and we could, of course, not fulfill all of the wishes that was on the wish list, but we focus on certain aspects that we find is very important, and of course also related to the original concept we had in the project. But some of the items that they identified important was access to nano information, that it's built, the system is built on the state-of-the-art knowledge. It should be flexible and easy to use for a wide range of specialists when we talk about the tools. So we should be able to allow human and environmental exposure, hazard and risk characterization, considering different exposure and release scenarios. If possible, it should be qualified for and aligned with the existing regulatory frameworks. We can align with the regulatory frameworks, but we cannot say that they are accepted because this is not our job to define the acceptance, but we can show whether the tools work as was done in the previous presentations by Anders and Mika. We should also look forward and be able to consider existing and future generations of nanomaterials, which I think is important if we talk about innovation. And if we should also try and link to databases and libraries to be able to harvest from existing knowledge. So next slide, please. So we remember this slide from the beginning. So this was the conceptual Nano-risk innovation governance framework. We have the stage gate and we have the emerging risk management framework supporting all of the projects and the stage gate decisions, having qualitative to quantitative test data driven methodologies for our risk assessment and management. Next slide, please. So if we jump back to the Nano-risk innovation governance framework and the project management decided, we created a two-layer structure. So we have basically for conducting our nano-risk governance, when we talk about running a nano-risk governance project, a two-layer structure where one is the governance layer, which is consisting of an accountable governance board. And this is basically the bosses who determine whether we go, rework, or stop the project. And then we have a second layer, which is the next slide, please, or next click, please, which is the operational project layer. And this should be a flexible layer because, as we learn from the stakeholder interaction, as we can understand also from the complexity of nanotechnologies, if we look at the entire branch of nanotechnology and use of nanomaterials, it has to be flexible so we can do specific governance in different sub-projects, and that can be established to generate and provide all the knowledge and data and documentation that are needed to develop the specific project towards launch of the innovation. And this project layer should, of course, answer to questions raised by the governance board. So basically satisfy the needs for proper governance of a project. And this structure is actually reflecting already existing ISO 21505 that was published in 2017. Next slide, please. So what we constructed is this two-layer system, as we see here. In green is the PhaseGate Nano-risk Innovation Governance Board. And in the red-orange at the bottom, we have the PhaseGate Nano-risk Innovation Governance project or projects that can be run by one or more project leaders. So the job of the governance board is to define the criteria for projects and set the projects, of course, set the questions to be answered, score the answers, and decide whether the project is going forward or not. The project layer their job is to run the projects, to get the knowledge, to answer the questions asked by the governance board, to assess the knowledge, and report, of course, for the stage gate meetings. And in the system, we also consider that we have an innovation phase that goes from idea scoping to business case, to research and development, to testing and validation, to review, and finally launch. And when we have launched the project or the innovation is now then moved over to the portfolio monitoring, which is shown in gray, and that basically is business as usual for the company. So this splits up the Cooper stage gate model a little bit in a way that we also make a clear distinction between what is the innovation phase and then what is the actual production phase. So at the project phase, we have a project leader and a monitoring of the projects as a task. Next slide, please. So to be able to run this system, we have developed a guidance document or guidance documents. Here's one example for the PhaseGate Nano-risk Innovation Governance and the supporting methods. So these are short guides for each of the phases of the projects and stages of the gates where the project results are assessed. Next slide, please. Projects can be a lot of things. So we have tried to collect some of the most common innovation governance or innovation risk management projects. So they include idea description, brainstorming events, technical nanomaterial and nanoproduct descriptions, stakeholder interactions, etc., etc. And on the next slide, you see the projects that are related more to the safety aspects, for example, development of the technical data sheets, collecting of existing health and safety data, safety data sheet developments, and then conducting different aspects of risk assessment, but also a safety by design stop analysis and testing, which is important to comply with when it comes to risk management in the workplace. We also have developments towards the communication, internal and external in the project. Next slide, please. So underlying this, we have a framework for the pre-risk assessment or risk assessment. So I try to compile into one scheme for all of the stages. So we have early stages where we have information gathering. If you look at the left side part of the graph, we have a start and then information gathering to do our pre-risk assessment or risk assessment and management, occupational risk assessments, downstream user risk assessments, environmental risk assessments, and then aspects of ethics, so define risk of a fire explosion, for example, for the early phases. And this is these are phases you can do before you actually start your innovation. It can be desk work to analyze the risks at early stages based on whatever information is possible to obtain. What is important to do in the same time is to consider safety by design and the STOP principles, so which is substitution, technical, operational, and personal protection. And this is done by a number of answers following this circle, which is shown with green boxes. For example, whether the material and chemical hazard can be reduced, whether the material and chemicals can be reused or recycled, whether there is a risk that can be reduced during production, downstream use, environmental risks during downstream use, and the final product, whether it can be fully or partially recycled, and then also consider the risks during waste handling and disposal. So these are concepts to underpin the pre-risk assessment, the full risk assessment management, and the safety by design or safety innovation approach framework. When you move into actual production or work in the lab, we need to have defined disposal, which we see on the left side, define the disposal and emergency procedures, decide monitoring needs, document and review, and finally train the R&D workers. So next slide, please. So this was what I wanted to say about the development of the framework in brief, and we should now move forward to have a sneak peek into the Nano-risk governance portal by Shomik.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shomik Chakravarti from Artec, and today I'll be giving you a sneak peek into the Nano-risk governance portal developed under the CALIBRAte project. Next slide, please. So under the CALIBRAte project, there were wide arrays of tasks, especially in terms of nano-risk identification, modeling, governance, generating data, different case studies, testing and validating tools, building guidances, and these were all combined in a way such that we can synthesize into work package 8, which was development of the Nano-risk governance portal. And there are 3 key topics under the portal. Next slide, please. I call them the triad, and that includes an interactive public page, a portal for tools and guidance, and lastly, innovation governance portfolio. So today my task is to give you a peek into each of them. Next slide, please, starting with interactive public page. So as Kjeld already mentioned, few of the parameters or few of the requests from the stakeholders were access to nano information. So we made it possible to access this kind of information as easily as possible in very user-intuitive app-like environment. So if I go to the next slide, I have an example where what is trending in nano. So we developed CALIBRAte Nano-risk radar, which is a horizon scanning tool, and just on the public page we show what's trending on nano, and users can see what are the key issues going on in different subjects. Next slide, please. Furthermore, there are a wide range of databases and libraries, tools and guidance documents which are which would be beneficial for R&D and industrial clients, and that we took care by giving a dedicated section for R&D and industry zone. Next slide, please. Next, we move on to portal for tools and guidance. And this is just a screen grab from the homepage of the portal, where there's a tool catalog with a bunch of tools and guidances and libraries, data libraries, for the more inspirational case studies to start your own. And if you go to the next slide, you will see that we populated the catalog with suite of tested tools, from horizon scanning to human and environmental exposure, hazard and risk characterization tools. And these are just few of them, and couple, and I will go through one or two right now, but there's a whole session on it on Thursday. Next slide, please. Lastly, under the innovation governance portfolio, which was developed as a dedicated tool for risk governance and project management, based or aligned on current standards in risk and project management, we developed a tool which would make it easy or possible to manage or to govern an innovation project through the two layers which Kjeld was talking in his presentation. So from the governance board layer, as well as from the project or sub-project layer. And today, if you click on one, so what it does is it will help an innovation project to go from each of these phases, starting from ideation to all the way through to review and launch and further portfolio monitoring. I won't go into details, but it includes guidances, a flexible methodology of using the tool, and an interactive UI so that users can get into the tool and start using it for innovation projects, especially related to nanomaterials. Next slide, please. To find out more, please log into Nano-risk gov-portal, which you can access through web and mobile. And if you want more details, please join us for the next webinar on Thursday. Thank you very much.